Jim Lawson had always believed in minding his own business. His home at the end of the quiet cul-de-sac was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind without interference. But the real crown jewel of his property was his 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle, a labor of love he had spent years restoring to perfection. The deep midnight blue paint gleamed under the sun, every inch polished and cared for like it had just rolled off the factory floor. It wasn't just a car, it was history, his history, and no one was going to take that from him. Which is why, when he looked out his window that afternoon and saw a tow truck parked in his driveway, chains already hooked to his Chevelle, his blood ran cold. Standing beside the tow truck, arms crossed and looking far too pleased with herself, was Nancy Reynolds, the self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood order, dressed in her signature neon green tracksuit. Her phone was pressed to her ear, but her gaze was locked on the car as if she had personally conquered it. The tow truck driver stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably, clearly caught between orders and uncertainty. Jim was out the door in seconds. "Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing?" Nancy turned, her lips curling into a condescending smirk as if he was the one intruding. "Oh, there you are," she said, like he was an afterthought. "This car is parked illegally, and I'm having it removed." Jim stopped dead, trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. His own driveway. His own car. He glanced around, half expecting hidden cameras, as if this had to be some kind of prank. "Illegally," he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "This is my driveway. That's my car." Nancy let out a sigh, the exaggerated kind reserved for explaining things to small children. "Actually, this is a shared driveway," she said, pointing toward the pavement like she had just discovered an ancient artifact. "And your car is in violation of HOA regulations." Jim stared at her. Was she serious? "My house isn't even part of the damn HOA." Nancy's smirk didn't falter. "Oh, I know. But your car is visible from the street, and the HOA has the right to enforce aesthetic standards. That thing," she waved a dismissive hand toward the Chevelle, "is an eyesore." Jim's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He had dealt with nosy neighbors before, but this was something else entirely. This woman genuinely thought she could control his property just because she didn't like his car? He turned his attention to the tow truck driver. "You realize this is private property, right? You tow that car, and you're committing grand theft auto." The driver hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. She said she got approval from the HOA president." Jim let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's cute. The HOA doesn't own my house." He stepped forward, putting himself between Nancy and his car. "Now, unhook it. Now." The driver hesitated, then quickly moved to release the chains. Nancy's smugness cracked for the first time. "This isn't over," she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger toward Jim's chest. He didn't even flinch. "It was over the second you stepped on my property." Nancy's face twisted with rage, but she spun on her heel and stomped toward the street, barking at the tow truck driver to follow. Jim watched them go, his jaw tight, his heartbeat still hammering in his chest. But he knew better than to think this was the end. This was only the beginning. Jim had dealt with difficult people before, but Nancy Reynolds was something else entirely. He knew she wouldn't take the tow truck defeat lightly, but he hadn't expected her to launch a full-blown campaign of harassment. It started small. The next morning, Jim found a bright yellow notice taped to his front door. At first glance, it looked official, printed on what seemed like HOA letterhead, stamped with a bold, all-caps warning. "Final notice, vehicle removal required. Your property is in direct violation of HOA Code 4.3.2, unauthorized vehicles in residential areas. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines and legal action." Jim almost laughed. The HOA had no authority over his property. His home sat outside its jurisdiction, a fact he had verified before moving in. This wasn't just an overreach. This was a lie. He crumpled the notice and tossed it into the trash. Then came the next move. That afternoon, as Jim stepped outside, he caught Nancy standing across the street, watching his house like a predator sizing up its prey. Her arms were folded, lips pursed, her expression unreadable. The moment she saw him, she turned and walked away, acting as if she had merely been admiring the neighborhood. By the next day, another notice had appeared. This time, it was taped directly to his car's windshield. Violation of community standards, immediate action required. A $500 fine has been issued for failure to comply with HOA regulations regarding vehicle visibility and neighborhood aesthetics. Jim ran a hand down his face, torn between exasperation and amusement. Was she serious? A fine? The HOA had zero power over his home, yet Nancy was treating this like she was the law. She was desperate to get rid of his Chevelle. Then, the real harassment began. The city inspector arrived first. A man in his 50s with a clipboard in hand knocked on Jim's door, informing him that there had been an anonymous complaint about an abandoned vehicle on his property. Jim nearly laughed. "It's not abandoned," he said, motioning to the pristine Chevelle. "I drive it every week." The inspector looked at the car, let out a low sigh, and shook his head. "I figured as much. We get calls like this sometimes." His voice carried the unmistakable exhaustion of a man who had dealt with HOA busybodies far too often. Jim smirked. "Nancy?" The inspector didn't confirm it, but his silence said everything. "Don't worry about it," he finally said. "You're in the clear." But Nancy wasn't finished. The next call was to noise control. Jim hadn't driven the Chevelle in 2 days, yet he received a notice from the city claiming his vehicle was causing excessive noise disturbances. Another lie. The third attempt was the worst. Late one evening, Jim heard a soft tapping outside his window. When he peeked through the blinds, he saw Nancy, crouched by his car, bolt cutters in hand. Adrenaline surged through him. He threw open the front door so fast it nearly flew off its hinges. "Hey!" Nancy jumped like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. She was literally inches away from cutting the lock on his will clamp. Her head snapped toward him, but instead of looking guilty, she straightened, brushing imaginary dust off her tracksuit. "I was just..." Jim folded his arms. "Just what?" "Checking if the lock needed maintenance." Nancy's eyes flickered with something, anger, frustration, maybe even a bit of embarrassment, but she recovered fast. She rolled her eyes and let out a condescending sigh. "I was making sure your car isn't leaking oil all over the driveway. This neighborhood has standards, you know." Jim let out a slow, deliberate breath. "If you ever step onto my property again, Nancy, I'll make sure you regret it." For the first time, Nancy hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. But then, as if flipping a switch, she let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, please," she taunted. "Call the cops. I'd love to explain how your car is a violation of HOA rules." Jim took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "My property isn't part of the HOA, Nancy. You have no authority here." Her expression darkened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed off into the night. Jim watched her go, his heart still pounding. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was war. Jim woke up the next morning with an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. He had dealt with his fair share of stubborn people before, but Nancy was something else. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was obsessed. And when someone like her didn't get their way, they escalated. He just didn't know how far she was willing to go. That question was answered the moment he stepped outside. His Chevelle was wrecked. Jim's breath caught as he took in the damage. Deep, jagged scratches ran the length of the driver's side door, long angry gashes carved into the pristine paint job he had spent years restoring. The side mirrors were smashed, shards of glass scattered across the pavement. His stomach clenched when he saw the worst of it, the windshield, completely spiderwebbed, as if someone had taken a crowbar to it. This wasn't just vandalism. This was rage. His hands clenched into fists as he stormed back inside, already pulling up the security footage from the night before. Fast-forwarding through the hours, his jaw tightened as the screen flickered and revealed the culprit. Nancy. She had come in the dead of night, her green tracksuit unmistakable in the dim glow of the street lamp. But she hadn't been alone. Two men stood beside her, both in dark hoodies. One held a crowbar, the other a baseball bat. Jim watched in disbelief as they went to work, one man taking out the mirrors in a single hit, the other slamming the bat against the windshield. Nancy, standing behind them, egging them on like she was directing a performance. Then, as if that wasn't enough, she stepped forward, pulled something from her pocket, and dragged it across the car's body. A box cutter. Jim felt his blood pressure spike. Enough. His fingers flew over his phone screen as he called the police, his voice sharp, controlled. "I have everything on camera," he told the officer as soon as they answered. Within 20 minutes, a squad car pulled into his driveway. The officer watched the footage in silence, then let out a slow exhale. "That's pretty damning," he muttered. Jim folded his arms. "So, what happens now?" "We'll file a report, start an investigation. She'll probably deny it, but with footage like this, you've got a solid case. I'd advise you to keep your car covered or in a garage if possible. If she's willing to key it once, she might try something worse." Jim's stomach twisted. He didn't have a garage, just the driveway. The officer left, promising to follow up, but Jim knew better than to expect immediate action. He had just declared war on Nancy, and she wouldn't take it lying down. Less than 24 hours later, a new letter arrived in the mail. It was another HOA violation notice. Penalty notice, immediate action required. A fine of $1,000 has been issued for failure to comply with HOA vehicle regulations. If the vehicle is not removed within 48 hours, further action will be taken. Jim burst out laughing. She was doubling down. Did she actually have connections to the HOA? Or was she just forging these notices herself? Not wanting to leave anything to chance, Jim drafted a formal appeal, attaching legal documents proving that his driveway was private property and not under HOA jurisdiction. He even included his property survey and city zoning records, then mailed it directly to the HOA board along with a strongly worded message. To whom it may concern. I am writing to formally dispute the violation notices I have received regarding my vehicle. As per the enclosed legal documents, my property is not under the jurisdiction of the HOA. Any further attempts to harass me with fabricated violations will be met with legal action. If you have any questions, I suggest you consult an actual attorney before sending fraudulent fines to a property you do not control. Sincerely, Jim Lawson. Satisfied, he mailed it off. But Nancy wasn't done yet. That night, Jim saw her pacing across the street, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly. She was angry, frustrated. Probably fuming over the fact that her fake fines weren't working. Jim was prepared for petty games. What he wasn't prepared for was how far she was willing to go next. The next afternoon, Jim ran out for groceries. He was gone for less than an hour. When he pulled back into his street, his stomach dropped. A tow truck was in his driveway again. This time, the driver had already hooked up his Chevelle, the chains wrapped around the front wheels, preparing to haul it away. Jim's foot slammed onto the gas pedal. He skidded into his driveway, slamming the car into park so fast he nearly tore the gear shift off. He was out of the car in seconds. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. The tow truck driver startled, nearly dropping his clipboard. Nancy stepped forward, arms crossed, smiling like a cat who had just caught a mouse. "Oh, Jim," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I tried to warn you. Since you refused to comply, the HOA had to take action." Jim stalked up to the tow truck driver, his tone like steel. "This is private property. If you so much as move this truck an inch, you're looking at a grand theft auto charge." The driver hesitated, glancing between Jim and Nancy. She said it was an HOA order." Jim let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Check the registration. You'll see my name on that car." The driver pulled out his clipboard, flipping through paperwork. His frown deepened. "Wait a second, this isn't a valid tow order." Nancy's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "I got approval from the HOA president." Jim took a step closer, his voice low and full of venom. "You mean the same HOA that doesn't own this property?" Nancy's face turned bright red. Jim turned back to the tow truck driver. "You might want to unhook my car before I call the police." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He immediately lowered the vehicle, undoing the chains. Nancy was fuming. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You don't belong here. That car doesn't belong here." Jim smirked. "Then why is my name on the title and not yours?" Nancy's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She let out an inhuman growl, then turned and stomped off down the street, her neon green tracksuit flashing in the sunlight like a beacon of pure hatred. Jim watched her go, his heart still pounding. He had won this round. But something in his gut told him this fight was far from over. Jim barely had time to enjoy his victory before the war escalated again. The next morning, as he stepped outside to grab his mail, a slow, creeping dread settled over him. Something felt off. The street was quiet, too quiet. The usual morning sounds were absent, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. And then he saw her. Nancy was standing across the street, watching him, her expression unreadable. Her arms were folded tight against her chest, her knuckles white from the pressure. For the first time since this nightmare had started, she wasn't smirking, wasn't gloating. There was something else in her eyes now, something ugly. Pure, unfiltered hatred. Jim held her gaze for a moment, then shook his head, scoffing under his breath as he turned away. She had lost. She knew it. If she wanted to stand there like a bitter sore loser, that was her problem. He wasn't about to waste another second on her games. But that night, Jim learned just how far she was willing to go. At 3:12 a.m., his phone buzzed with an alert. His security cameras had detected movement in the driveway. Still groggy, he grabbed his phone and pulled up the live feed. His blood ran ice cold. Nancy was back. But she wasn't alone. Two men in dark hoodies stood beside her. One of them held a baseball bat, the other a gas can. Jim bolted upright, adrenaline surging through his veins as he immediately dialed 911. "I have intruders on my property," he said, his voice sharp and controlled. "Two men and a woman, attempting to set my car on fire. I have them on live security feed right now." The dispatcher assured him officers were on their way, but Jim wasn't about to sit and wait. With one tap, he activated his floodlights. The entire driveway lit up like daylight, catching the three intruders dead in their tracks. One of the men flinched, stumbling backward, gas can in hand. The other froze, bat raised mid-air, as if he had been caught playing some demented game of freeze tag. Nancy, however, stood her ground. Her face twisted with fury, but it wasn't panic or fear that filled her eyes, it was rage. "Do it," she snapped at the man with the gas can, her voice sharp, desperate. But before he could even think about making a move, the sound of approaching sirens split through the night. Nancy's head snapped toward the street, her expression finally cracking as police cars screeched into the driveway, red and blue lights flashing. The two men panicked. One of them dropped the gas can and ran, bolting toward the side street, but he didn't make it far. Two officers tackled him before he could escape, pinning him to the pavement. The second man tried to run as well, but he barely made it 3 steps before officers cut him off, forcing him to the ground. Nancy? She just stood there, watching it unfold. Her fists clenched, her breathing erratic, as if she were fighting some internal war between denial and realization. On the ground, one of the officers barked, hand hovering over his holster. For the first time, Nancy hesitated. She glanced between Jim and the officers, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, to talk her way out of it. Then, in one last act of sheer defiance, she spat on the ground and snarled, "This neighborhood was better before you moved here." Jim folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Funny," he said, voice calm. "Everyone else seems to disagree." Nancy didn't get another word out before an officer grabbed her wrists and snapped on the handcuffs. "You are under arrest for attempted arson, criminal trespassing, and conspiracy to commit property damage. You have the right to remain silent." Jim barely heard the rest. He just stood there, watching as Nancy Reynolds, the woman who had made his life hell for weeks, was shoved into the back of a squad car. Her reign was over. But it wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just some crazy woman with a clipboard and too much free time. Nancy had orchestrated a full-scale attack on a neighbor, all because she hated the idea that she couldn't control someone else's property. And if she had done this to him, how many others had she harassed, intimidated, or threatened over the years? As the police pulled away, Jim exhaled, rolling his shoulders to shake off the tension. It was over. But in the back of his mind, a new thought began to take shape. Maybe it was time to find out just how deep Nancy's corruption ran. The neighborhood felt different the next morning. Lighter. Freer. Nancy Reynolds was gone, and with her, the suffocating grip she had tried to impose on everyone. Jim stood in his driveway, staring at the wreckage left behind, the shattered windshield, the deep scratches in the Chevelle's paint. It would take time to fix, but it was nothing compared to the battle he had won. But Nancy's downfall wasn't just about his car. It was about every single person she had terrorized over the years. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once stayed silent started sharing their own stories. The single mother who was nearly forced out of her home because of Nancy's false CPS complaint, the retired veteran couple fined for hanging an American flag, the family who had paid thousands in bogus HOA fines just to avoid her harassment. And the real kicker? Nancy had never even been an official HOA member. She had manipulated the system, forged documents, and weaponized the HOA's name to build her own twisted little kingdom. But that kingdom had just burned to the ground. Jim didn't stop with her arrest. He took everything he had, security footage, fraudulent fines, harassment reports, and walked it straight into the HOA office. The fallout was immediate. The HOA board, desperate to save face, issued a formal statement condemning Nancy and claiming they had no idea about her actions. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Residents were furious, demanding reform. And reform they got. A new HOA board was elected, one that immediately banned all fines without written verification, refunded every fraudulent charge Nancy had issued, and removed the HOA's right to tow vehicles without legal due process. And Jim? He received a personal apology and a check for $10,000, half for the damages Nancy had caused, half as a settlement to keep him from suing them into oblivion. The neighborhood changed overnight. Houses that had once looked stiff and uniform sprouted color, front yards filled with gnomes, decorations, even a line of plastic pink flamingos as a joke about Nancy's downfall. And the best part? The HOA was powerless to stop it. A month later, Jim got an unexpected letter. From Nancy. The scrawling, angry handwriting was almost laughable. I hope you're happy. You ruined everything I built. That neighborhood was mine. You're a nobody, and you'll always be a nobody. Enjoy your little victory. It won't last. Jim chuckled, shaking his head. Even from prison, she couldn't accept that she had lost. Without a second thought, he crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. Later that evening, Jim slid into the driver's seat of his newly restored Chevelle. The engine rumbled beneath him, smooth and powerful. He eased onto the road, the cool night air rushing through his open window, carrying away the last remnants of Nancy's toxic reign. As he passed his neighbor's house, Bill raised a beer in salute. Jim honked twice, grinning. For the first time in months, the street was peaceful. No threats. No fines. No Nancy. And for Jim? That was the sweetest victory of all. But HOA horror stories never seem to end, do they? Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare or a Karen neighbor like Nancy? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.